The weapon that changed everything. The transport truck lurched through the gates of Camp Nguyen Hue on March 15, 1968, its canvas cover flapping in the humid Vietnamese air. Sergeant Marcus Whitefeather Thompson sat rigid among the other captured Marines, his hands bound, his mind replaying the firefight that had led to this moment. 3 weeks had passed since that desperate night in the evacuation corridor outside Hue City, when his unconventional Mossberg MVP had kept thousands of civilians alive through sustained suppressive fire. Now the rifle was gone, confiscated, and Thompson faced an uncertain future in enemy hands. The camp sprawled before them, bamboo barracks, guard towers, and cooking fires, sending aromatic smoke into the afternoon heat. What struck Thompson immediately wasn't the harshness he'd expected, but an almost mundane orderliness. Vietnamese guards moved with routine efficiency, not the savage brutality his training had promised. Children played near the perimeter fence, their laughter carrying across the compound like an impossible sound from another world. "Out, out!" called a young guard in broken English, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. He couldn't have been older than 20, Thompson realized, younger than his own brother back in Nebraska. The contradiction lodged somewhere between Thompson's chest and throat. How could the enemy look so ordinary? Corporal Danny Reeves, his former spotter, caught Thompson's eye as they climbed down from the truck. Neither man spoke, but the same question hung between them. What had they been taught to expect versus what they were actually seeing? The briefings had painted pictures of torture chambers and systematic cruelty. Instead, they faced processing tables staffed by tired-looking clerks, taking names and checking medical conditions. "You are injured?" asked a Vietnamese medic, pointing to Thompson's bandaged shoulder. The man's English was careful, practiced, and when Thompson shook his head, the medic simply made a note and moved to the next prisoner. No threats, no intimidation. Just paperwork. That first night, lying on a straw mat in the bamboo barracks, Thompson stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he'd believed about this war. The guards had issued thin blankets and bowls of rice soup that, while meager, seemed to be the same food they ate themselves. Through the walls, he could hear Vietnamese voices discussing what sounded like ordinary concerns: families, weather, the shortage of medicine. The other prisoners whispered among themselves, their voices carrying the same confusion Thompson felt. Staff Sergeant Riley, a career Marine from Alabama, kept insisting this was all an act, that the real treatment would begin tomorrow. But Thompson remembered the young guard's weary expression, the medic's efficient kindness, the children playing by the fence. These people didn't look like the monsters from training films. As sleep finally came, Thompson's last conscious thought was of his Mossberg MVP, wondering if his captors understood what they'd taken from him. That rifle had taught him that sometimes survival meant adapting beyond doctrine, that flexibility could save more lives than rigid tradition. Now, in this place that defied his expectations at every turn, he wondered if the same lesson might apply to everything else he'd believed about war. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How do you hold on to who you are when everything you were taught starts crumbling around you? The morning routine at Camp Nguyen Hue began at dawn with the sound of a wooden bell, not the harsh alarm Thompson had expected. Guards moved through the barracks calling roll in Vietnamese, checking each prisoner with the methodical boredom of factory workers. Thompson noticed they carried their rifles loosely, almost carelessly, not the tense vigilance of men expecting trouble. Thompson Marcus, the young guard from yesterday, read his name carefully, mispronouncing the th sound. When Thompson responded, the guard made a check mark and moved on. No threats, no demonstrations of power, just routine. The mess hall served rice with vegetables and occasionally small portions of fish. Thompson had expected starvation rations, but while the food was simple, it appeared adequate. More puzzling was watching the guards eat the same meals at nearby tables. Vietnamese conversations mixed with American complaints about the heat, creating an oddly domestic atmosphere that felt nothing like the camps from his nightmares. "This don't make sense," muttered Staff Sergeant Riley as they sat with their breakfast. "They're supposed to be breaking us down, making us weak. This feels more like—" "Like what?" asked Corporal Reeves. Riley struggled for words. "Like they're just trying to keep us alive." The work details proved equally confusing. Thompson found himself assigned to maintaining the camp's vegetable garden alongside a middle-aged Vietnamese farmer named Duck, who spoke enough English to explain proper planting techniques. Duke treated the work seriously but showed no hostility toward his American helpers. When Thompson instinctively offered to carry a heavy water bucket, Duke simply nodded thanks and continued with his planting. "You have farm at home?" Duke asked during a rest break, offering Thompson a drink from his own water canteen. "My family raises corn in Nebraska," Thompson replied, then immediately wondered why he was sharing personal information with the enemy. Duke nodded thoughtfully. "Corn good. Feed many people." He paused, studying Thompson's face. "War make farming hard. Too many young men go fight, not enough stay plant food." That afternoon brought Thompson's first real glimpse into the contradiction, eating at his certainty. While weeding between vegetable rows, he overheard Duke talking quietly with one of the guards. Though Thompson understood no Vietnamese, the farmer's gestures toward the garden and his worried expression suggested concerns about crop yields, about feeding people. These weren't the fanatical warriors from training films. They were farmers and clerks and young men far from home, dealing with the practical problems of keeping a camp running during wartime. The evening rice distribution reinforced this unsettling normalcy. Guards portioned food carefully but fairly, even giving extra to prisoners who looked particularly thin. Thompson watched a young Vietnamese soldier help an elderly American sergeant to his feet after the man stumbled, steadying him with gentle hands that contradicted everything Thompson had been taught about enemy brutality. That night, lying on his straw mat, Thompson found himself thinking about his Mossberg MVP again, not the weapon itself, but what it had taught him about adaptation. In Hue City, rigid doctrine would have meant civilian deaths. His hold and fire technique had saved lives precisely because it abandoned traditional sniper training in favor of what the situation actually required. Now he faced a similar challenge with his own preconceptions. Everything he'd believed about Vietnamese cruelty was colliding with daily evidence of ordinary human behavior. The guards seemed tired, overworked, concerned with mundane logistics rather than ideological warfare. Even their uniforms looked worn and patched, more like working clothes than military menace, yet accepting this reality felt like betraying something fundamental. His training, his brothers, his country's narrative about this war. If these people weren't monsters, what did that make his own side's actions? What did that make him? The questions followed Thompson into uneasy sleep, accompanied by the sound of Vietnamese voices discussing tomorrow's work schedules with the same weary resignation he'd heard in Marine barracks back home. Letters from home arrived on March 28th, carried by Red Cross volunteers who moved through the camp with careful neutrality. Thompson's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope bearing his wife Sarah's familiar handwriting, postmarked 3 weeks earlier from their small Nebraska town. "Marcus," the letter began, "the whole town's praying for you. They say you're a hero for what you did in Hue City, saving all those people. The newspaper called your rifle technique revolutionary and said the Marine Corps is already changing their training because of you. I'm so proud, but I just want you home safe." Thompson stared at the words, feeling the weight of contradiction settle heavier in his chest. A hero. The newspaper made him sound like he'd single-handedly won the war, not that he'd been captured while trying to keep civilians from being massacred. The letter continued with news from home, corn prices, his father's arthritis, their neighbor's son shipping out to Vietnam. normal life continuing while Thompson sat in this place that defied everything he'd been taught to expect. Staff Sergeant Riley read his own letter with growing agitation. "Listen to this," he said, his voice tight. "My wife says the whole neighborhood's talking about how we're probably being tortured, how the enemy don't follow the Geneva Convention. She's organizing prayer circles for our suffering." Thompson looked around the mess hall where they sat reading mail. Vietnamese guards played cards at nearby tables, their laughter mixing with American conversations. A young soldier was teaching an elderly prisoner basic Vietnamese numbers, both men smiling at the elderly Marine's pronunciation mistakes. Where was the suffering Sarah's friends imagined? "They don't know," Corporal Reeves said quietly. "Back home, they can't see this." "Can't see what?" Riley's voice carried an edge of desperation. "That these people ain't the savages we were told about. That they're just people." The question hung in the humid air like incense from the small shrine near the kitchen, where Vietnamese staff left offerings of rice and fruit. Thompson had watched the ritual for days, recognizing something his grandmother might have done at her Methodist church back home. The same human need to ask for protection, for enough food, for loved ones' safety. That afternoon's work detail took Thompson and Duke to repair a section of fence damaged by recent monsoon rains. As they worked, Duke shared stories about his own farm, destroyed early in the war when American bombing had targeted a suspected weapons cache in his village. "My corn all gone," Duke said simply, driving a fence post into muddy ground. "House too. Wife and children go live with her family in Hanoi." Thompson's hands stilled on the wire he was stretching. "I'm sorry about your farm." Duke shrugged, with the resignation of someone who'd lost everything once and learned to keep working anyway. "War destroy many farms. Your farm's safe in Nebraska?" "Yeah," Thompson replied, then felt the inadequacy of the word. His family's corn grew tall and green while Duke's lay under bomb craters. The arbitrary nature of geography, of which side of a conflict you were born on, struck him with uncomfortable force. That evening, another letter arrived. This one official from Thompson's commanding officer. "Your innovative techniques at Hugh City saved over 3,000 civilian lives," it read. "Your hold and fire method is being studied at the highest levels. The Corps is proud of Marines like you who think beyond doctrine when lives are at stake." Thompson folded the letter carefully, his mind churning. The same flexibility that had made him a hero in Hugh City was now forcing him to question everything else he'd accepted without examination. If doctrine could be wrong about sniper tactics, what else might it be wrong about? Riley read over Thompson's shoulder and shook his head. "They want us to be heroes for killing the enemy, but what if the enemy ain't what they told us?" Neither man had an answer. Outside, Vietnamese voices discussed the next day's rice distribution, the same mundane logistics that kept any community functioning. The sound was becoming familiar, almost comforting, and that familiarity scared Thompson more than any torture could have. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." April brought the monsoon rains to Camp Nguyen Hue, turning the compound into a maze of mud and makeshift shelters. Thompson found himself spending more time in the camp's small infirmary, helping Dr. Pham, a thin man in his 50s who spoke excellent English and treated American prisoners with the same careful attention he gave Vietnamese guards. "Hold still," Dr. Pham said, cleaning an infected cut on Thompson's hand from fence work. "This climate, small wounds become big problems if not properly cared for." The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and herbal medicines, with shelves holding both modern medical supplies and traditional remedies. Thompson had initially been suspicious of the treatment, expecting substandard care or worse. Instead, he found competent medical attention delivered with quiet professionalism. "You were sniper?" Dr. Pham asked while applying bandages. Thompson tensed. "Yes. My brother also sniper," the doctor said calmly. "French War, then American War. He say hardest part not the shooting, is the waiting, the thinking. Is he, Thompson began, killed at Dien Bien Phu, 1954. Dr. Pham's voice carried no bitterness, just the flat acceptance of old grief. He was 19, very good with rifle, like you, I think. Thompson stared at his bandaged hand, trying to process this information. The enemy doctor's brother had been a sniper too, probably not much different from himself. Young, well-trained, fighting for what he believed was right. The parallel felt too close for comfort. Staff Sergeant Riley appeared in the infirmary that afternoon with a fever, his face flushed and his speech slurred. Dr. Pham immediately moved him to a quiet corner and began treatment with the same attention he'd shown Thompson. Malaria, the doctor diagnosed after taking Riley's temperature. Common here. We have medicine, but he must rest completely. Over the following days, Thompson watched Dr. Pham tend to Riley with genuine concern. The Vietnamese physician checked on his patient every few hours, adjusted medications, even brought special broths from the kitchen to help with Riley's recovery. When Riley's fever broke on the 4th day, Dr. Pham smiled with visible relief. "Why?" Riley asked weakly when he was well enough to talk. "Why take such good care of us?" Dr. Pham considered the question while organizing medical supplies. "Hippocratic oath," he said finally. "First, do no harm. Not say, except to enemies. Just say, do no harm." The simplicity of the answer left both Americans silent. Thompson found himself thinking about his own oath as a Marine, to protect and serve. In Hue City, that oath had meant protecting civilians regardless of their nationality. Here in the camp, Dr. Pham seemed to follow a similar principle. That evening, Duke sought out Thompson during the evening meal. "You look troubled, friend," the farmer said, settling beside him with a bowl of rice. "Just thinking," Thompson replied, "about home, about everything." Thompson struggled to put his confusion into words. "We were taught that you people, that the enemy was different, cruel, inhuman." Duke nodded slowly. "War make people tell stories about each other, make enemies seem not like people, easier to fight." "But you are people," Thompson said, the words feeling dangerous even as he spoke them. "Yes," Duck agreed quietly, "just like you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a new group of prisoners, American soldiers, captured during fighting near Da Nang. Thompson watched them stumble from the transport truck with the same shell-shocked confusion he'd felt 3 weeks earlier. Their faces showed the same expectation of brutality, the same surprise at the routine processing, the mundane reality of camp life. One young private, barely 18, kept looking around with wide eyes. "Where are the torture chambers?" Thompson heard him whisper to another prisoner. The question cut through Thompson like a blade. 3 weeks ago he would have asked the same thing. Now he understood that the torture was more subtle. It was having everything you believed slowly, quietly proven wrong, leaving you suspended between two truths you couldn't reconcile. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a simple mistake in the camp office. Thompson had been assigned to help with filing, his neat handwriting making him useful for administrative tasks, when he accidentally opened the wrong folder. Inside, he found detailed reports on every American prisoner, written in both Vietnamese and English. His own file was remarkably thorough. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, sniper, captured during Hue City evacuation operation, demonstrated unusual tactical innovation with sustained suppressive fire technique. Saved estimated 3,000-plus civilian lives, including Vietnamese refugees. Recommendation: medical watch for depression. Subject appears to be questioning ideological framework. Thompson's hands trembled as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological state. But it was the next document that stopped his breathing entirely, a directive from higher command dated 2 days after his capture. All captured American snipers to be treated with special consideration. Intelligence suggests their training emphasizes civilian protection. These individuals may be more receptive to re-education efforts. The folder contained similar assessments for other prisoners. Staff Sergeant Riley, career Marine, rigid ideological conditioning, likely resistant to perspective change. Corporal Reeves, intelligent, observant, responds positively to humanitarian treatment. Each man had been sorted, categorized, assigned a treatment protocol designed to challenge their preconceptions about the enemy. The kindness Thompson had witnessed, Dr. Pham's medical care, Duke's farming lessons, the guards' casual humanity, wasn't spontaneous. It was policy. "You are not supposed to read those." Thompson spun to find Dr. Pham standing in the doorway, his expression more sad than angry. "It's all planned," Thompson said, his voice hollow. "The kindness, the normal treatment. You're trying to break us psychologically." Dr. Pham entered the room and closed the door. "Yes and no," he said after a long pause. "Orders say, treat Americans well. Show them we are human. But Marcus," he used Thompson's first name for the first time, "the kindness is real. The food we share with you, we truly cannot spare. The medicine I give you, my own soldiers go without." "Then why?" Thompson's question came out as a whisper. "Because someone must break the cycle, Doctor," Pham replied, settling into a chair across from the desk. "American soldiers are taught we are savages. We are taught you are demons. Both cannot be true. So we choose to be human first, enemy second. Hope maybe you choose the same." Thompson stared at the files scattered across the desk. "But it's manipulation." "Yes, but manipulation toward truth or toward lies." Dr. Pham's eyes were weary. "You are sniper. In Hugh City, you broke doctrine to save civilians. Was that manipulation of your training or truth of your heart?" The parallel hit Thompson like physical force. His Mossberg MVP techniques had been improvisation born from necessity, adaptation that saved lives by abandoning rigid doctrine. Now he faced the same choice, with his entire worldview: cling to what he'd been taught, or trust what he was experiencing. "What happens when the war ends?" Thompson asked. "You go home. Tell them what you saw here. Maybe some believe you, maybe not." "Doctor," Pham shrugged, "but you carry truth now, not just propaganda. That change everything, even if only for you." That night, Thompson lay awake thinking about the Mossberg MVP gathering dust in some enemy weapons depot. The rifle had taught him that sometimes the most effective action required abandoning everything you'd been taught about how things should work. His hold and fire technique had saved civilian lives precisely because it ignored sniper doctrine in favor of situational necessity. Now he understood that the same lesson applied to everything else. The Vietnamese had shown him their humanity, not despite their orders, but because of them. Orders written by people smart enough to understand that breaking cycles of hatred required someone to choose truth over propaganda. Staff Sergeant Riley would never accept this reality. Thompson could see the man's growing desperation as his rigid beliefs fractured against daily evidence of Vietnamese humanity. But Thompson himself had already crossed some invisible line, acknowledging what his eyes saw over what his training had taught him. The question now was whether he would have the courage to carry that truth home. The exchange came on June 12, 1968, part of a broader prisoner swap negotiated through Swiss intermediaries. Thompson stood in the same compound yard where he'd first arrived 3 months earlier, but everything looked different now. The guards he'd learned to recognize individually, the kitchen staff who'd shared their meager supplies, Dr. Pham, who'd treated American prisoners with the same care as his own soldiers. They all carried faces and stories now, not just enemy uniforms. "You take this," Duke said quietly, pressing something small into Thompson's palm. It was a wooden cross, carved from bamboo with careful precision. "My daughter make for me. Maybe help you remember." Thompson closed his fingers around the cross, his throat tight. "I won't forget. Remember good and bad both," Duke advised. "Truth need both sides." Dr. Pham approached with a medical folder. "Your shoulder healing well?" he said, the words formal but his eyes showing deeper concern. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. Going home after this, sometimes harder than staying." The warning proved prophetic. Thompson's homecoming to Nebraska was everything Sarah's letters had promised. Parades, newspaper interviews, ceremony after ceremony, celebrating his heroic innovation at Hugh City. Everyone wanted to hear about his revolutionary hold and fire technique, how he'd saved thousands of civilian lives by thinking beyond doctrine. No one wanted to hear about Camp Nguyen Hu. "Must have been hell," said the reporter from the Omaha World-Herald. 3 months in enemy hands. The torture, the psychological warfare. How did you resist their brainwashing? Thompson held Duke's bamboo cross in his pocket, feeling its smooth edges worn by careful hands. "It wasn't what I expected," he said finally. "Course not. The enemy's clever that way, making camp seem normal to break your spirit. But you stayed strong, kept faith in America, right?" The words Thompson wanted to say crowded in his throat about Dr. Pham's medical care, about sharing rice with farmers whose crops had been destroyed by American bombs, about guards who played cards and worried about their families like soldiers anywhere. But he could see in the reporter's eyes that such truths wouldn't be welcome, wouldn't fit the story people needed to believe. Staff Sergeant Riley, also repatriated, took a different approach. At his own debriefing, he painted vivid pictures of systematic abuse, psychological torture, guards who'd threatened and intimidated prisoners daily. His account matched what everyone expected to hear about enemy brutality. "Riley's lying," Corporal Reeves said quietly to Thompson after reading the newspaper coverage, "making up stories about torture that never happened." "Maybe he's telling the truth he needs to tell," Thompson replied, understanding something about the different ways men carried impossible burdens. Years later, Thompson would establish a small workshop behind his family's Nebraska farm, where he'd restore old rifles, including a few Mossberg MVPs acquired through collector networks. Working on the rifles helped him remember both parts of his war: the night in Hugh City when innovations saved civilian lives, and the months in Camp Nguyen Hue when Vietnamese kindness had quietly demolished everything he'd believed about enemies. He kept Duke's bamboo cross on his workbench next to tools that maintained weapons designed for killing, but could also, in the right hands, protect the innocent. Sometimes former Marines would visit, veterans drawn by stories of his unconventional techniques. A few would ask about captivity, and Thompson would tell them what they seemed ready to hear. Only to his grandson years later did he tell the complete truth. About Dr. Pham's Hippocratic Oath, about Duke's destroyed farm, about guards who'd shared their own rations with prisoners. The boy listened with the open attention of youth, not yet taught what stories were acceptable. "Were they really the enemy, Grandpa?" the boy asked. Thompson looked at the Mossberg MVP he was cleaning, remembering the night it had become something more than a rifle, the months when enemy kindness had become something more than propaganda. "They were people," he said finally, "just people in an impossible situation, trying to choose between hatred and humanity." The bamboo cross caught afternoon light from the workshop window, its carved surface smooth from decades of handling. Sometimes Thompson still wondered what had become of Dr. Pham, whether Duke had ever rebuilt his farm, whether any of the guards remembered the strange months when being human had mattered more than being enemies. But mostly, he just remembered what his Mossberg MVP had taught him twice, first in Hugh City, then in captivity, that sometimes the most important innovation is abandoning what you've been taught in favor of what the moment requires. Even if that moment requires acknowledging the enemy's humanity, even if carrying that truth proves harder than any hatred ever could. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.